of Aalco in the coming year. We wish to assure you, Mr. President and the Vice President, of Kenya's support during your tenure as President and as Vice President. Let me also express, on behalf of the Kenyan delegation, our sincere appreciation to the outgoing President, Honorable Ambassador Koji Haneda of Japan, for the accomplishments achieved during his tenure. Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to thank the Aalco Secretariat, and in particular, His Excellency Professor Kennedy Gaston, Secretary General, for his tireless efforts in steering the work of this organization and ensuring that the interests of the two regions are well articulated at various international fora, such as the United Nations, the International Law Commission, and the World Trade Organization. We also appreciate the work of the Aalco Secretariat in monitoring developments in topical areas in the UN and other international institutions, and in conducting and presenting results of various studies to keep member states informed. We also note with much appreciation the training opportunities on different aspects of international law that have been extended to Aalco member states by China and Japan under the auspices of Aalco, from which government officials from Kenya have greatly benefited. Mr. President, in our modern and increasingly globalized world, interconnectedness and interdependency are a reality, and therefore the theme of this session, multilateralism and the international legal order based on international law, is very timely. Kenya recognizes the importance of strengthened multilateral engagement in the promotion of international cooperation and for enhanced collaboration in finding lasting solutions to global challenges. During the 57th annual session of Aalco held in Tokyo, Japan, the importance of the blue economy to mankind was acknowledged in the discussions on the agenda topic on the law of the sea. Indeed, in recognition of the importance of multilateral engagement in addressing contemporary international issues, Kenya hosted the first Sustainable Blue Economy Conference, which brought together participants from 184 countries with the aim of learning how to build a blue economy that harnesses the potential of our water bodies and leverages on latest innovations for our common good of mankind while conserving waters for future generations. Kenya continues to forge greater collaboration not only within the United Nations system, but also other international institutions and bodies such as Aalco and the Commonwealth. Kenya participated at the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly held in September this year at the UN headquarters, where Kenya stressed the need to reaffirm the values of the UN Charter that embrace a common humanity, safeguards a rules-based international order, and underscores equality and respect of all humanity. However, Kenya also identified that there is need to re-energize the multilateral system in order to guarantee the world's common future, and more importantly, to reform the multilateral system to ensure its centrality in global governance, to reflect the diversity of our nations, and to ensure that multilateral organizations become more responsive to issues affecting all countries and all regions of the world. Kenya therefore recognizes the important role that Aalco continues to play in providing an important multilateral platform for member states of Aalco to develop common positions on contemporary legal issues in relation to critical topics such as the promotion of international peace and security, international trade, the law of the sea, the status of refugees, and sustainable development. Mr. President, we therefore note with interest the items on the agenda at this session, which will give Member States an opportunity to deliberate on important topics such as peaceful settlement of disputes, and we note that this will focus on international environmental disputes, international trade law, international trade and investment law, among others. We also note with particular interest the significant time allocated to this latter topic, that is international trade and investment, and that experts will speak on this topic. We welcome this as the creation of a predictable, transparent, international legal framework and an enabling environment for a fair, multilateral trading system is of great importance and interest to all member states present, and we look forward to these deliberations. To conclude, Mr. President, allow me, on behalf of the Kenyan delegation and on my own behalf, to express our pleasure at being here in this beautiful city of Dar es Salaam, in our neighboring country, on this auspicious occasion of the 58th session of Aalco. I also wish to take this opportunity to thank the government of the United Republic of Tanzania and her people for the warm welcome and hospitality extended to us since our arrival. I thank you. Asante sana, Bwana Rais.
Thank you very much, Kenya. Of late, you have demonstrated leadership by convening a international conference on the blue economy, and your intervention has been very consistent with the theme of this Aalco conference this week. Thank you very much indeed. Appreciate it. I see a request from another member state before we move to the non-member states for an additional statement. The People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor again. China welcomes the general statements that focus on multilateralism and international order based on international law we have yesterday and this morning. We believe many of these general statements are in-depth, constructive, and insightful and thought-provoking. Regrettably, we heard yesterday one distinguished delegate mentioned a single case, that is the South China Sea Arbitration Award case. Because this case has bearings on core interests of China, I hereby to provide more information just for the purpose of clarity for delegates in the room. Yesterday, one distinguished delegate in his general statement held that the South China Sea Arbitration Award as a victory of international rule of law. But the fact is just the opposite. The award is highly controversial and widely criticized. Rather than a so-called victory, it is actually a setback to rule of law and a strike right in the core value of international law. The South China Sea arbitration relates to the territorial sovereignty disputes and maritime delimitation disputes in the South China Sea, which is either beyond the scope of the convention or barred from the third-party adjudication or arbitration by China's declaration pursuant to the law of the sea convention. However, the tribunal, on the basis of subjective assumption instead of facts and law, erroneously found it has jurisdiction and delivered an illegitimate award by distorting the provisions of the law of the sea convention. This arbitral award will be remembered as a typical example of how international law could be abused and used as a pretext to instigate or exacerbate disputes. Mr. President, China has repeatedly made it clear our position that we neither accept nor participate in the arbitration, neither accept nor recognize the illegal award. We take this position not only to protect our own legitimate rights, but also to ensure the integrity, authority, and credibility of the law of the sea and the whole international law regime, and to preserve the international order based on international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for that clarification. Now we proceed to hear statements from non-members of Aalco. And the first speaker in this category is Belarus.
Afternoon. Distinguished Chairperson, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to express gratitude on behalf of the Republic of Belarus to Aalco Secretariat for inviting us to participate in this session in the capacity of an observer. Our words of thanks also go to our generous hosts, the government of the United Republic of Tanzania, for perfectly arranging this meeting. Belarus highly values this opportunity to exchange views with such representative body of experts, lawyers, and diplomats. As suggested by the agenda of yesterday and today, in my statement, I'll focus on multilateralism and national order based on international law. The world nowadays faces a number of acute challenges, such as threats to international peace, security and sustainable development, as well as climate change. International communities striving to find adequate responses to combat terrorism, international organized crime, drug and human trafficking, migration. We hope that eventually we would come to understanding that a single state, or even a group of states, regardless of their level of development, is not in a position to address these issues and to prevent military, economic, or economical disasters. Belarus firmly adheres to multilateralism, which is implied in particular that modern challenges require a commensurate collective response of global scale. In our view, this essence of approach is aptly summarized in the SDG motto, leave no one behind. This relates not only to individuals, but to states and regions as well. No one should be overlooked, and every state and region must have equal rights in setting up and implementing universal solutions. It is obvious that only by genuinely multilateral paths we would be able to mobilize political, economic, and intellectual and other resources needed to face the contemporary challenges. The United Nations, which seems to be a natural leader and coordinator in these efforts, should fully embrace its role and responsibility. In this regard, in particular, we reject extraterritorial and unilateral coercive measures or laws, including unilateral economic sanctions, other intimidating actions, as well as arbitrary travel restrictions that limit the charter-based sovereignty and independence of states and restricts the freedom of trade and investment. Belarus is of the view that the restriction of freedom of trade and investment, sometimes supported by the United Nations Security Council, which is supposed to be the only body empowered legitimately impose sanctions, whatever the perceived denomination is the only one. Actions by other states and groups of states simply hijack the prerogatives of the Council and undermine the authority of the United Nations and multilateral system as a whole. Responsibility, in our view, is the key to multilateralism. A lot is spoken nowadays about rights. Rights of minorities, rights of communities, rights of individuals. These are extremely important. At the same time, each of us individuals and states alike should realize the responsibilities and obligations we carry, international legal obligations of states, mutual obligations of governments, societies, and individuals enshrined in our constitutions, responsibility of our generation, past, generous, and the one to come. If we intend to leave a habitable planet for our children, we should pay the debt to our ancestors by not repeating their mistakes. Of such fatal mistake would be the departure from the principles of the United Nations Charter and the whole system of international law based on them. A perfect legal case can be made, and is repeatedly made, for such departures. The history has shown, however, that international law based on voluntarily established rules, on equal partnership of international actors, is the only viable alternative to survival of the fittest on planetary scale. This choice has already been made back in 1945, and Belarus, as a founding member of the United Nations, remembers all too well the price to be paid. As our measurable contribution to strengthening multilateralism and international order based on international law, Belarus is for several years advocating the need to stop confrontation and restart an inclusive dialogue on a key of security in our region, similar to the Helsinki process in 1970s. It is worth mentioning in this room that one of the tangible outcomes of the process that was the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which serves as one of the fundamental pillars of rule of law on regional level. We attach fundamental importance to the rule of law on international level, which accords predictability and legitimacy to the actions of states and strengthens their sovereign equality. We sometimes witness references to fundamental national interests as pretext to violating international legal obligations. In our understanding, in long run, adhering to international law is exactly in fundamental interests of every nation, big or small, weak or powerful. I thank you so much for the possibility of having the floor and your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your analysis and the underpinnings of the evolution of international law and the role of sanctions and the illegality of those sanctions, if not through the Security Council, very consistent with the theme of our discussion. We really appreciate for this very insightful analysis and the evolution of the international order since the end of the Second World War. Thank you. I now call upon Germany.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates, my country, Germany, is honored to take part in this 58th annual session of the Asian-African Legal Consultative Organization. We highly value this opportunity to engage with the legal advisors and indeed the legal fraternity from Africa and Asia. We would like to thank the government of the United Republic of Tanzania for their warm welcome and the General Secretariat of Aalco for the excellent arrangements that they have made. Mr. President, you have chosen multilateralism and the international legal order based on international law as general theme for this debate. The choice, of course, is very timely and pertinent to our work as legal practitioners. Multilateralism and its opposite, unilateralism, provide different answers to the question how states can or should address international issues. So it is a question of method, but it goes further. At the heart of multilateralism lies an international order that is based on rules, rules applicable to all. In other words, international law is the DNA of multilateralism. These rules, international law, have always been challenged in all kinds of ways and by all kinds of actors. These challenges may lead to changes in the law, and I may add that change is inherent, even necessary in law. So we should not be afraid of change. The question is rather, what change and how? Mr. President, today we are facing a triple challenge: the return of great power competition, the rise of nationalism and populism, the apparent weakness of the international system for addressing new global issues. These challenges are fueled by economic concerns, including the uneven distribution of the fruits of globalization. And there is no doubt about it, the issues of our time, many of them of an existential nature, have become more complex. This is fertile ground for those that look for easy answers rather than for the right answers. This is where going it alone finds resonance. This is where the rule of law may seem as an obstacle rather than as a protector. This is not the order that states here present today have been advocating, an order based on strengthened multilateralism with the United Nations at its core, an order that we have an interest in preserving. This is why Germany, together with other UN member states, organized an event at the margins of this year's high-level week of the UN General Assembly in New York, setting up an alliance for multilateralism. The idea of the Alliance for Multilateralism is to create a network of countries allowing for the constitution of flexible issue-based coalitions formed around specific projects and policy outcomes. It concentrates in particular on the three following streams of action: to protect, preserve, and advance international law, including internationally agreed norms, agreements, and institutions, through political initiatives, budget contributions, the provision of capabilities and expertise, to drive strong initiatives where there is the need to further develop and thereby strengthen the multilateral system, in particular where governance is absent or insufficient, and to reform and to modernize existing international institutions in order to make them more inclusive, representative, democratic, transparent, accountable, and more effective. Our call was heeded overwhelmingly. 52 foreign ministers or deputy foreign ministers participated in that event. We will continue to work together to take and support initiatives that feed into the three streams of action referred to, and organize further meetings to pursue and broaden our collective efforts. Why are we so convinced of the importance of international law? We believe that the rules-based international order and international law at its core lie in our national interest. But we are also convinced that they lie, at least in the long run, in the interest of all countries and in the interest of the international community as a whole. In this context, let me briefly make 3 points. First, international law is imperative for all countries to be able to participate in international relations on an equal footing. In a world order based only on power and the exercise thereof, those who hold the most power and use it most ruthlessly will win. International law offers a fundamentally different approach, that of sovereign equality of states. Second, international law acts as the guardrails of just foreign policy action. It places boundaries on arbitrary power politics. The prohibition of the use of force enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations is paramount in this regard. It embodies the aspiration and the promise that countries can, as a matter of principle, deal with one another without the use of violence. This was a quantum leap in the history of international law. Third, law creates peace. It provides countries with procedures for resolving conflicts in peaceful ways. The rise in the number of cases before international courts in recent decades shows that ever more countries are making use of the possibilities for peaceful settlement of conflicts that international law offers. Mr. President, in the past 100 years, we have progressed from a world in which might is right to a world governed, although imperfectly, by the rule of law. We have moved away from a world where mighty nations acted alone to a world in which countries, big and small, cooperate in order to achieve their common objectives. We as international lawyers called upon to be the guardians of a multilateral rule-based international order. Unilateralism will not disappear, but it is our duty to make sure that it remains under constant watch to justify itself against the backdrop of international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Germany, by bringing a totally new perspective on international law and the character of the international system now, in particular, the meeting that was held on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly last month. Thank you very much indeed. The next in our list of speakers, Russian Federation.
First of all, I would like to congratulate you both, Mr. President and Mr. Vice President, for your election, and thank the government of Tanzania and the city of Dar es Salaam for kindly hosting this important event. We also like to thank the Aalco Secretariat for all the efforts invested and arrangements made. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, today I have the honor to present the general statement on behalf of the Russian delegation on a very important and urgent topic, multilateralism and the international legal order based on international law. Russia maintains the position that respect for international law is a key element of stability in international relations. Its universally recognized principles and norms constitute a solid ground for interstate cooperation and serve as a reliable basis for fair, transparent, and sustainable international relations. We support the further enhancing of compliance with international law in international affairs, as well as the equal and just participation of all states in its development. Violation of fundamental principles of international law, such as the sovereign equality of states and non-interference in their internal affairs, has resulted into escalation of violence in several regions, for example, in the Middle East. We consider unacceptable any actions to interfere in the internal or external affairs of states in order to overthrow their legitimate governments or influence their policy in domestic or international relations. Striking examples of violation of the non-interference principle is the extraterritorial application by some states of their national legislation and unilateral sanctions. Currently, the system of contemporary international law is being challenged. Approaches are being promoted which obviously water down the existing legal grounds. In first line, the sovereignty of states. They represent a threat for the current legal order. For example, we witness attempts to replace the order based on international law by something alternative, sometimes referred to as rules-based order. In fact, the so-called rules contradict collective norms and principles fixed in the UN Charter and represent the views of certain states or group of states and serve to promote their narrow political interests only. The practical example of this trend is establishment of attribution mechanisms that are called upon to name, shame, and ultimately instigate unilateral sanctions. They are established by voting without any attempts to reach consensus. They contradict the rules of the international organizations, including the UN Charter, as in the case of so-called mechanism for Syria, IIIM, or violate the Chemical Weapons Convention in case of investigation or identification team IIT in OPCW. The proponents of these mechanisms don't use legal arguments. Instead, they simply advocate that existing norms do not work properly, the UN is paralyzed, or the international community is passive and unable to meet serious challenges. Russia, on the contrary, has always stood for collective, consensual decisions considering the needs of all states in accordance with international law. We believe that the existing legal order based on the UN Charter and universally recognized principles and norms needs to be maintained in order to strengthen stability and security in international relations. At the same time, the alternatives to international law can jeopardize multilateralism, lead to its fragmentation. Therefore, it is necessary to ensure that states consistently comply with their obligation, especially with those established within the UN, and above all, the principles of non-interference and respect for sovereignty. In this regard, the idea of multilateralism in international relations becomes crucial, meaning that the international community as a whole should establish, through the conclusion of international treaties and the establishment of international customs. For instance, as the evidence of adherence to this principle, we propose to start negotiating a multilateral universal instrument aimed to combat cybercrime. We, together with a number of states present here in the room, introduced a draft resolution in the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly called Countering the Use of Information and Communications Technologies for Criminal Purposes. It is calling for creation of an open negotiating platform for this purpose with participation of every interested state, not limited to any region. Hope for your support and co-sponsorship. Only together we can find the right solution. I will be deliberating on this issue, of course, more in detail under appropriate agenda item. Thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much indeed for putting the United Nations at the center of this discourse on international law and multilateralism. We look forward to more animated intervention, as you promised, in the subsequent discussion on cyber law. Thank you. The next speaker from non-member states is Afghanistan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. His Excellency the President, His Excellency Vice President, General Secretary of Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, Aalco, distinguished ministers, head of delegations, representatives of the member state observers, and valued guests. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today, it is an urgent need to further develop and strengthen cooperation for the purpose of addressing the challenges that lay before the economic, commercial, legal, and cultural development of our countries. Therefore, availing myself of this opportunity, I would like to briefly touch on some of the important issues such as strengthening world trade and laws of the World Trade Organization, justice cooperation, and judicial collaboration in combating terrorism, reinforcement of laws providing opportunities for the implementation of relevant conventions at the member states level in all international investments. Distinguished participants, In the past 2 years, after acquiring the membership of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and 2016, Afghanistan has been unable to process and enforce 23 legislative documents relevant to this organization and international treaties, amongst them the law on protection of private investment, law on protection of consumers, law on foreign trade in goods, mines law, and law on customs, are to be named a few. As mentioned earlier, I am sure that the enforcement of these legislative documents strengthen the commercial relations between Afghanistan and other countries, and the trade and employment opportunities will improve, and countries availing the experience of each other would be able to identify, solve, and fill the existing gaps in the arena of international trade and investment. Furthermore, one of the efficient and important steps Afghanistan has taken recently on August 2019 is the signing of the Singapore Convention on Settlement of International Trade Disputes through mediation. This convention may play a long-lasting bridging role in the area of international trade amongst the member states. In addition, with the implementing of the provision of this convention, the opportunities for investment would increase, and it would lead to strengthened solidarity in the trade relations amongst the countries in a way that, according to the convention, they would settle their trade dispute amicably with lesser cost and the earliest possible times through mediation without recourse to the courts. On the other hand, the international terrorism as one of the biggest challenges in the fact treating the interests of all countries and provides opportunity for numerous other transboundary crimes such as money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other organized crimes, which unfortunately these crimes are transmitting as a contagious disease, as consequently since long they inflict countless materials and intellectual losses to the people of Afghanistan in particular and to the people of the world in general. Since Afghanistan as a member of international community has extent possible has prevented the growth and prevalence of the terrorism of the countries of the region and world. As international cooperation, it is tremendously important to develop practicable policies and strategies on the basis of which the role of societies in developing legislative, criminal, and executive policies should not be only ensured more than ever, but to implement them appropriate ways should proactively be explored, and at the same time, necessarily measures must be adopted to attract required international cooperation, similarly as an important principle for establishing stability and economic prosperity. Amongst the countries, the rule of trust building should not be ignored, and special attention must be paid not only to build it, but also to further strengthen it. Afghanistan is in this regard, in order to attract the trust of the people and other institutions, has processed, adopted, and published some of the important laws, such as law on combat against corruption, law on access to information, and law on protecting the whistleblowers of administrative corruption. Above all, the law on trade arbitration and law on mediation in trade disputes have been adopted, taking the multiple agreements that Afghanistan has concluded with various governments in this regard, which will undeniably facilitate a speedy, impartial, and just settlement of trade and economic disputes. For the purpose of promoting the international rule of law, Afghanistan has constantly availed from the best internationally accepted practices and from the experience of the developed countries to further enrich international legislative documents, and actively has participated in the important international forums and conferences, amongst them the program related to equal access to justice, sustainable development goals, addressing the legal requirements of the person, upgrading the quality level of justice services, and eradication of inequalities, and providing proper opportunities for investment are a few to be mentioned. However, Afghanistan, more than any other country, has suffered ruthless atrocities from the terrorists and insurgent groups. It has so far been able to take effective steps with regard to international cooperation, amongst which concluding and implementing protocols and multilateral agreements with the countries of the region and the world on combating against narcotics, extradition of the accused and criminal, terrorism, separatism, and extremism, and narcotics transit, trade, and services are to be named. To address these transboundary menaces, it is important to establish necessary coordination and judicial collaboration amongst the relevant countries. This objective shall only be realized when laws of our countries are compatible with the international principles and value, and all countries' responsibility cooperate amongst themselves in supporting the battle against terrorism and other security challenges. At the end, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the people and the government of United Republic of Tanzania and the Secretariat of AALCO for inviting Afghanistan to this splendid gathering. And I hope that member states and the observer of the state of this conference, as usual, extend their support to the just cause of Afghanistan and its people in combating against international terrorism and other ominous phenomena. With thanks, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. You don't hear very often first-hand information about Afghanistan and the dynamics of challenges that are taking place there. Thank you very much indeed. This is very revealing. Really appreciate. I hope most of us will generate an interest and continue to follow what is happening in Afghanistan. It's really one of the hot spots in the world. But as we have been told, there are fundamental changes that are taking place there, especially in the rule of law. Thank you very much indeed. Now I think we have finished the non-state interventions. Now we invite international organizations that have requested to make statements. We begin with the International Criminal Court.
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, Secretary General, it is a pleasure to see you at the helm of this 58th session of the Aalco. On my own behalf and on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor, I wish to congratulate you on your election and wish you all the best as you steer the work of this committee to its successful conclusion. I welcome the opportunity to be here in this beautiful city of Dar es Salaam. And I thank Aalco and Tanzania for inviting me to this occasion. Mr. President, after your very good remarks about the introduction to Tanzania, and after the sumptuous meal and the entertainment yesterday, I'm sure that I speak on behalf of most of us here that we all want to be associated with Tanzania. I personally am looking for opportunity to be an honorary citizen of Tanzania following all this. I'm honored to address this august body and provide an overview of the work of the Office of the Prosecutor and discuss a number of important challenges that the office faces in conducting its core activities mandated under the Rome Statute. I do, of course, recognize that not all Aalco member states are states parties to the Rome Statute. That said, the objectives of our organizations converge as we both seek to advance a world order based on the rule of law. The theme of multilateralism and the international legal order based on international law resonates with all of us, given that the increasing decline in multilateralism negatively affects us all. The International Criminal Court was established in 1998 with adoption of the Rome Statute as the first and only permanent international criminal court with a mandate to investigate and prosecute war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and since last year, the crime of aggression. These are serious crimes, the crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. With the establishment of the ICC, an important normative but also structural and system-based message was sent globally. The first message is that the commission of mass atrocities as merely politics by other means will no longer receive a pass, and that perpetrators, irrespective of rank or official status, must answer for their crimes. That an international justice system based on cooperation and complementary action between authorities at the national and international level is crucial to a rule-based global order. And that its institutional manifestation in the form of the ICC is now a reality and an important part and parcel of the international system. Today, the court benefits from membership of 122 states parties and has possibly greater reach due to the court's jurisdictional competence. Indeed, given its potential universal scope, the Rome Statute does not predetermine situations of investigation and prosecution. It is the Office of the Prosecutor that determines when and where the court should exercise its jurisdiction with appropriate judicial oversight. Given this important role and immense responsibility, it is not unexpected that the court has its supporters and detractors. The court does indeed face resistance, in particular as it extends the scope of its activities in geographical terms. Regrettably, in the exercise of its important mandate, some states do not shy away from launching frontal attacks on the court, including with a view to interfere with its independence. This comes in addition to other challenges, including limited financial means and cooperation challenges on the one hand, and immense expectations from direct victims, affected communities, civil society, states parties, and international community writ large on the other hand. These challenges notwithstanding, we remain committed to the important mandate bestowed upon us by the Rome Statute, as we are clear about the immense responsibility we shoulder and the importance of the court to cultivating a culture of accountability for atrocity crimes and to the rules-based global order. In every decision and every action that the office undertakes, it is tried to say that the only guarantor and shield are the Rome Statute legal dictates. As an office, we can only try our sincere and honest best with the courage or convictions to seek to execute our mandate independently, impartially, and objectively. These principles drive and will continue to drive all the office's actions. Let me stress here that no pressure can deter the office from carrying out its statutory duties. Indeed, at such times when international criminal justice is under direct assault by ill-wishers, where we are witnessing a clash and crisis of fundamental values, silence from the international community is not a technical communication, but deafening, sending the wrong signal to the authors of such policies that they have a free rein to proceed unchecked, that the unthinkable is the new normal, and that we are willing to allow the costly advances we have made in international criminal justice to regress. This, I submit to you, we cannot allow. It is a time like this that courage and conviction must guide our actions to protect our common values and goals, and to assist the court by insulating it from attacks aimed at undermining its judicial independence, and to give all of us, legal professionals and champions of the rule of law, who are in the trenches, who are assuming personal risk to do this crucial work, hope in the knowledge that we stand united in the defense of international criminal justice. Mr. President, the Office of the Prosecutor conducts preliminary examinations of all situations that come to its attention through communications submitted to the office or following referrals by state parties or the United Nations Security Council to determine whether situations warrant investigations. The office is currently conducting various preliminary examinations around the world, in Colombia, Guinea, Iraq relating to UK forces, Nigeria, Palestine, Ukraine, the Philippines, and Venezuela. The purpose of this process is to determine whether or not legal criteria, and I must stress, legal criteria, not political criteria, under the statute are met to justify an investigation. Investigations are also ongoing, including in the Burundi, Central African Republic, Uganda, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Darfur, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Georgia. The judges are also seized of proceedings in relation to the situation in Afghanistan to determine if the office may be authorized to initiate investigations. On 15 January 2019, judges acquitted by a majority Mr. Bagbo and Mr. Blegude of all charges in relation to crimes allegedly committed in Cote d'Ivoire. To us, this shows that justice cannot only be seen to be done, can only be done, but must also be seen to be done. By contrast, on July 2019, the ICC judges found Mr. Bosco Ntaganda guilty of 5 counts of crimes against humanity and 13 counts of war crimes committed in Ituri, DRC in 2002 and 2003. Recently, on 30 September 2019, the judges confirmed the charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity brought by the prosecutor against Mr. Al-Hassan for crimes that include rape and sexual slavery and persecution of the inhabitants of Timbuktu in Mali on religious and gender grounds. This case has now been committed to trial. Earlier this month, the court also held hearings to confirm charges in another case, that against Yakatom and Mrs. Yakatom and Ngoisan in relation to the situation in Central African Republic. This is just a sample of ongoing work. Ultimately, however, it is not the quantity, but the quality of investigations and prosecutions that we pride ourselves in. Throughout all our activities, we evaluate and learn lessons and aim to constantly improve our work methods and practices. We are nonetheless cognizant of the office and the court, by extension, that we cannot operate on our own. In the Rome Statute spirit of complementarity and cooperation, the office has been making efforts to develop a coordinated investigative and prosecutorial strategy for crimes under the Rome Statute, as well as other crimes that foster further insecurity in the situations where the office is activated, as well as in the world at large. Our engagement with law enforcement authorities from a great number of countries allows for collaborative efforts to gather and analyze information and helps to identify which of the judicial actors may be in the best position to investigate or prosecute alleged crimes. Such a symbolic relationship is crucial to an effective investigation and prosecution of atrocity crimes across the globe. Ultimately, the effectiveness of the office will largely depend on external factors. For example, the continued presence and influence of 15 suspects at large in situations where we investigate contribute to a large extent to protracted tensions and violence. Even for the day-to-day conduct of the office investigations, we rely heavily on the cooperation and assistance of states, for instance, for the purposes of identifying the whereabouts of persons of interest, the examination of places and sites, including the exhumation of mass graves, the provision of records such as financial, military, or asylum records, and the protection of victims and witnesses. Mr. President, despite our best efforts, I regret to observe that the world today is facing a particularly turbulent period. We see many protracted conflicts plague our continents, which in combination with rising nationalist ideologies pose a threat to international institutions and multilateralism, with the credibility of the system of international law regularly being questioned. We at the International Criminal Court have seen what political attacks we can expect when working in the service of justice. During these difficult times, we must stand firm. We must stand firmly with our beliefs. The cause of international criminal justice has been implanted in our consciousness, and it is a reality. There must be no going back in this forward march of humanity. We ought to remember at all times that the implementation of a system of international criminal justice was not merely a choice. It was a necessity based on the experience of centuries of suffering from the most atrocious crimes. On this path, we have come a long way, but we have miles yet to go, still before the protective embrace of international criminal law reaches all four corners of the globe for the betterment and progress of humanity. I thank you for your attention, Mr. President.
Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation on the lacuna that has existed on the international justice system that allowed those serious war crimes to go unpunished, but now at least the crimes against humanity, crimes of war, genocide, and aggression have a place to be tried, notwithstanding the political controversies around the ICC. We still wish you all the best. The next presentation is from the Committee of Public Legal Advisors from the European Union.
Mr. President, first of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the African Asian Legal Consultative Organization, and in particular to its Secretary General, Professor Kennedy Gastorn, for offering me this opportunity to present the work of the Committee of Legal Advisors on Public International Law, which is known by its acronym CARDI. The name of the committee in its French version, Comité ad hoc sur le droit international public. I also thank Secretary General for his participation in several meetings of CARDI. Let me thank also Tanzania for hosting this important event. I have recently taken part in, and I believe many of you too, the second World Meeting of Societies for International Law in The Hague, where the title of the first plenary roundtable has been new crisis of international law, or threat of collapse of the international legal order. In the discussion that followed afterwards, one of the speakers challenged the very title of this roundtable by saying that there is no crisis of international law, but rather the crisis caused by the lack of political will of states to respect international law. I believe here the point. In this context, I see the role of us, legal advisors on international law, as crucial for shaping the decisions of our political leadership. And the same can be said about CARDI and Aalco, whose mandate and work is quite similar, as I will try to demonstrate in my statement. My presentation will be focused on the three following issues. First, the background of CARDI and its current composition. Second, the contribution of CARDI to the development of public international law. And third, the contribution of CARDI to the work of the International Law Commission and the Sixth Committee of the UN General Assembly. The CARDI is an intergovernmental committee which brings together the legal advisors of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and the member states of the Council of Europe, as well as a significant number of observer states and organizations. The CARDI reports directly to the Committee of Ministers, the executive body of the Council of Europe. Its origins can be traced back to the 90s, when the political architecture of Europe was being redesigned and the Council of Europe was playing a key role in the political changes in the Central and Eastern Europe. The legal advisors of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs actively participated in this process. In 1991, its predecessor, Committee of Experts, was transformed into the current Committee of Legal Advisors on Public International Law, CARDI. Its first meeting took place in Strasbourg in April 1991 under the chairmanship of Mr. Helmut Türk, the Austrian legal advisor at the time, and on that occasion, the CARDI welcomed a special guest, the Crown Prince of Spain, now King Felipe VI. The long life of CARDI started with key legal discussions for the Council of Europe at that moment. State succession in Europe in relation to treaties, state property, archives, and debts. 16 legal advisors attended the first meeting of the CARDI. At present, 28 years later, after its birth, the CARDI brings together the legal advisors of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, as well as 5 observer states to the Council of Europe and 4 further observer states to the CARDI, and the following 10 participating international organizations, including the European Union, UN, and others. In 2017, participant status was granted to you, the Aalco, and I would like to emphasize the importance that the CARDI attaches to your organization. The heads of delegations participating in the CARDI meetings are the legal advisors of the respective ministries of foreign affairs themselves, thus ensuring representation of the states at the highest possible rank. I have been the chair of the CARDI since 2019 and was re-elected as chair for 2020. Second, in the framework of a truly pan-European setting, the CARDI is a legal forum for coordination, but also for discussion, reflection, and advice, being a laboratory of ideas, which is essential for the development of international law. CARDI's biannual meetings allow participants to inform each other on topical issues of common interests and to engage and to exchange national experience and practices, so we do not have to reinvent the wheel. As a concrete example of CARDI's contribution to the development of public international law, I would like to mention the pilot project on state practice regarding state succession and issues of recognition, which can be found in a 1999 book encompassing the practice of 16 member states of the Council of Europe. Another important initiative in which the CARDI was directly involved was the revised model final clauses for conventions, additional protocols, and amending protocols concluded within the Council of Europe, adopted by the Committee of Ministers in 2017, duly taken into account the latest developments in treaty law and the fact that the conventions concluded under the auspices of the Council of Europe have not only become varied as regards their subject matter, but also in relation to an ever-widening reach beyond Europe. This global reach of the more recent Council of Europe conventions and protocols has led to an increased participation of non-member states alongside the European Union and other international organizations. Today, out of the 223 treaties concluded within the Council of Europe, 153 are open to non-member states, upon invitation by the Committee of Ministers. For instance, since 2012, the Treaty Office has received over 100 requests from non-member states to become party to Council of Europe conventions. For example, the Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters has far more signatures and ratifications from non-member states, 67, than the number of Council of Europe member states, which is just 47. Let's continue with another example in the field of treaty law, which is also one of the CADI's flagship activities. In its capacity as the European Observatory of Reservations to International Treaties, the CADI examines reservations and declarations subject to objection at its meetings, thereby promoting and monitoring the state's adherence to the international law. The CADI examines both the reservations and declarations made to the Council of Europe conventions, as well as to the conventions deposited with the UN Secretary General. In carrying out this examination, the CADI makes use of the so-called dialogue réservataire, a concept based on good faith and fostering dialogue and conciliation. This working method not only allows states which have formulated a problematic reservation to have an opportunity to clarify its scope and effect, and if necessary, tone it down or withdraw it, but also allows other delegations to understand the rationale behind reservations before formally objecting to them. In this regard, we are observing the revival of a trend to subordinate the application of treaty provisions to domestic law. As we know, such reservations are inadmissible under international law due to Article 27 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and sometimes because they are against the object and purpose of a treaty too. Third, the CADI also plays an important role in fostering cooperation and collaboration between the Council of Europe and the United Nations. The external dimension of the CADI is illustrated by the fact that CADI experts, the legal advisors of the Council of Europe member and observer states, equally take part in the sessions of the 6th Legal Committee of the UNGA, which allows us to have legal coherence on certain issues and to act as a link between the two organizations. Furthermore, in order to strengthen this cooperation, the CADI invites as guest speakers the UN Legal Council, the President of the ICJ, and each September has an exchange of views with the chair of the International Law Commission. Indeed, the work of the ILC is on the agenda of all CADI meetings as a permanent item. These annual exchanges of views are the tangible evidence of the close links developed between the two institutions. As an example of a multilateral solution to a legal problem, I would like to inform you on the Declaration on Jurisdictional Immunities of State-Owned Cultural Property, which I believe can have a direct impact on the practice of states. The declaration, developed within the framework of CADI, is a non-legally binding document which expresses a common understanding of opinio juris concerning the fundamental rule that certain kind of state property, cultural property on exhibition, enjoys immunity from any measure of constraint, such as attachment, arrest, or execution in another state. By signing this declaration, a state recognizes the customary nature of the relevant provisions of the UN Convention on Jurisdictional Immunities of States and Their Property from 2004, which, as you know, has not yet entered into force. The declaration was a joint initiative of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of my country, the Czech Republic, and Austria, who signed it in 2013 and opened it for signature by other states, members and non-members of the Council of Europe. To date, the declaration has been signed by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of 20 states, members and non-members of the Council of Europe. The CADI Secretariat performs the functions of the depository of the declaration. Furthermore, the declaration was circulated among the members of the United Nations under the agenda item, the rule of law, at national and international levels of the UN General Assembly in 2017 in order to raise the awareness about the declaration beyond the Council of Europe. The input of CADE to discussions of important and topical issues of public international law is by far not limited to discussions at its biennial meetings. In between the meetings, the evidence on state practice concerning a certain topic currently under consideration is being collected and, on several occasions, has served as a basis for a publication. This allows us to make research available to the outside general public. For instance, in 2017, CADE agreed on the preparation of a publication on the topic immunities of special missions. This CADE publication was prepared by Sir Michael Wood, member of the ILC and former CADE chair, together with Mr. Andrew Sanger, and it contains an analytical report on legislation and practice, including the main trends arising from the replies to the questionnaire prepared by the CADE on this matter and provided by 38 CADE delegations. I would also like to mention the 3 databases set up by the CADE, which correspond to major research projects covering the immunities of states and international organizations, the organizations and functions of the Office of Legal Advisor in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the implementation of UN sanctions and respect for human rights. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that CADE is a legal forum which assists to and cooperates with member and non-member states and international organizations in order to develop the rule of law at the international level as a key factor in the interstate relations. The CADE has played and continues to play, after 28 years of its existence, an important role in the development of public international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
A very detailed explanation of an organization which to many of us was new, but we are lucky that we are establishing working relationship with this organization and look forward to benefiting from it. The last intervention this afternoon from a non-member state is from the International Committee of the Red Cross. ICRC.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the elections. And voila, Mr. Secretary General of Aalco, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates. Thank you to the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization and to the government of the United Republic of Tanzania for providing the International Committee of the Red Cross this opportunity to address Aalco's 58th annual session. The ICRC is a neutral, independent, and impartial organization whose exclusively humanitarian mission is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of armed conflict and to prevent violations by promoting international humanitarian law, or IHL. This year is the 70th anniversary of the defining instrument of contemporary IHL, the 4 Geneva Conventions. At their adoption in 1949, the conventions developed and advanced the law for the benefit of civilians who only a few years earlier had borne the horrific brunt of the Second World War. Perhaps most prophetically, the Geneva Conventions, through Common Article 3, also came to regulate the behavior of belligerents in conflict opposing state and organized non-state armed groups. Today, this framework for so-called non-international armed conflict is a critical part of the Geneva Convention's enduring legacy. The conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Ukraine, and nearer to us here in Libya, Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan remind us every day of the importance to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. With our partners, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, we bear witness to catastrophic consequences of armed conflict, hostilities in and sieges of urban areas and their humanitarian implications, including displacement. Increasingly protracted conflicts affect utilities, services, and commodities, threatening lives and causing major development setbacks. Yet there is cause to celebrate the Geneva Conventions. We can be immensely proud of what the conventions represent and how they have been appropriated. They are universally ratified. Every state has expressed its commitment to preserving humanity in war. Every day we work to address violations of IHL. However, we remain convinced that parties to the armed conflict are also adhere to the law. Every time that medical care is provided to those in need, detainees can communicate with their families or civilians are spared, IHL is working. Decades later, updated and strengthened by the 1977 additional protocols and other instruments, the Geneva Conventions are still fit for purpose. IHL is as relevant today as it was in 1949. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, distinguished delegates, the ICRC and Aalco share a history of constructive engagement to promote IHL. We have had opportunity to present a range of humanitarian and related legal considerations, including humanitarian access, sexual violence, and internal displacement. These topics remain relevant today. This year, the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in Africa, also known as the Kampala Convention, turned 10 years. It is the world's first and only legally binding instrument for internally displaced persons, a milestone in efforts to address displacement across Africa and a model for other regions. The ICRC urges all African states to support this vital instrument and, in doing so, strengthen the African framework of interstate cooperation and support. Here in the East and Horn of Africa, we are also focused upon the implications of the illicit, unregulated trade in conventional weapons. Despite some important differences, regional instruments such as the Nairobi Protocol for the Prevention, Control and Reduction of Small Arms and Light Weapons and the International Arms Trade Treaty share common purpose. Through regulation of trade in and access to weapons, both instruments aim for peace, security, and the reduction of human suffering. Both can serve humanitarian and development ends. In many respects, they are complementary and mutually reinforcing. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, let us turn to another topic with profound legal and humanitarian implications: the limits that IHL imposes upon cyber operations during armed conflicts. As we all know, technological developments offer tremendous opportunities for humanity, but they also entail risks. In today's armed conflict, cyber operations are already being used as a means or method of warfare. A few states have publicly acknowledged their use, and an increasing number of states are developing military cyber capabilities, whether of offensive or defensive purposes. The ICRC welcomes the attention that Aalco has given to the topic international law in cyberspace since its 53rd annual session in Tehran. We congratulate Aalco for having the foresight to establish, almost 5 years ago in Beijing, an open-ended working group on international law in cyberspace. These decisions have placed Aalco on the forefront of the global conversation on these matters. This year's annual session presents Aalco member states with a further opportunity to take a leading role, including the relation to IHL. The ICRC is deeply concerned about the potential human costs of cyber operations. Although at present most cyber attacks are not part of ongoing armed conflict, such attacks generate significant economic costs and have on occasion disrupted the provision of essential services to the civilian population. The healthcare sector is particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks. Other critical civilian infrastructure, including electricity, water, and sanitation, have also been affected. These attacks are reportedly becoming more frequent, and their severity is increasing more rapidly than anticipated. With this in mind, we welcome the inclusion of a provision aimed at ensuring respect for IHL in paragraph 2H in the consensual basic principle of international law applicable in cyberspace. In the ICRC view, there is no question that cyber operations during armed conflict are regulated by international humanitarian law, just like any other means and methods of warfare used by a belligerent in a conflict, whether new or old. What IHL provides is an additional layer of protection against the effects of hostilities. For example, under IHL, belligerents must respect and protect medical facilities and personnel at all times. Accordingly, cyber attacks against the healthcare sector during armed conflict would in most cases violate IHL. Likewise, the IHL principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution afford protection to civilians and civilian objects and objects indispensable for the survival of civilian populations enjoy more stringent specific protection. Critical civilian infrastructure is therefore afforded strong protection against the efforts of cyber attacks during armed conflict. We welcome the effort of Aalco, its member states, and its open-ended working group to study how international law applies to cyberspace with a view to promoting common understanding. By adopting the draft principle, Aalco would contribute to progressing the international conversation on the issue. We thank Aalco for giving us the opportunity to engage on this and stand ready to lend our expertise to such discussion. One of our legal advisors from Geneva will be here for the entire day tomorrow to support these deliberations. To come to a close, the Geneva Convention symbolizes our enduring and common humanity, rooted in ideas which have existed in all civilizations. They limit the devastating effect of warfare. Its pragmatic rules are grounded in battlefield realities and designed to protect and respect human life and dignity. The conventions do not legitimize or prolong war, but instead, by reducing suffering, they help prepare the ground for peace. While the destructive effects of conflict are today most visible in the physical world, the protective scope of IHL also extends to cyberspace. This is why we urge states to affirm that IHL imposes limits to the use of cyber operations during armed conflict. The unique characteristics of cyberspace, however, raise questions about the interpretation of IHL rules, questions that states must urgently address. Affirming that IHL applies to cyberspace and discussing its interpretation does not imply that new rules might not be useful or even needed. But if new rules are developed, they should build upon and strengthen existing law. Thank you, Mr. President and distinguished delegates. We appreciate, as always, your interest in respect of our mutual ambition to promote international humanitarian law and to ensure its continued relevance for today's armed conflict. Thank you very much.
Well, anything I say about ICRC will be an understatement, because ICRC speaks for itself. And I really encourage the partnership with Aalco, especially in this new area of cyberspace. And ICRC is in many ways a gift to humanity, I should say. And as we observe the anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, I think we should scale up our partnership in this area. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Yes. We still have one, and this is really the last one. UNEP, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellency, President of the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, Dr. Augustine Mahiga, Your Excellency, Vice President of Aalco, Honorable Mohamed Shalde, Your Excellency, Secretary General of Aalco, Dr. Kennedy Gaston, heads of delegation, Attorney Generals, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Let me straight ahead congratulate you, Mr. President, and the Vice President for being elected to this particular position of leadership within the Aalco. I'm honored to make this statement or to read this statement on behalf of the United Nations Environment Program, and specifically our law division, headed by Ms. Elizabeth Mrema, who couldn't make it here today. And I'm actually the head of office for Tanzania. So it gives me a very great pleasure to address this 58th annual session of the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization on the very significant topic of peaceful settlement of international environmental disputes. Mr. President, I'm personally very happy for this particular theme, which complements and creates a very good balance with what UNEP is doing in partnership with United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in this country and across the region to enhance the capacity for investigation and prosecution of environmental crimes and disputes. So it's a very good complementing theme. Dispute settlement has long been a focus of interstate relations and remains an important tool for dealing with international environmental problems. All nations that have signed the United Nations Charter are under an obligation to settle their disputes peacefully, including through negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements, or other peaceful means they may choose. The United Nations Environment Program has, through its Program for the Development and Periodic Review of the Environmental Law, known as Montevideo Program, promoted the development of mechanisms for peaceful settlement of environmental disputes. For instance, the second program, Montevideo Program 2, had among its objectives the further development of mechanisms to facilitate the avoidance and settlement of environmental disputes. It therefore endorses a strategy of developing methods, procedures, and mechanisms that promote inter alia, informed decisions, mutual understanding, and confidence building with a view to avoiding environmental disputes, and where such avoidance is not possible, to their peaceful settlement. In 2005, Mr. President, UNEP and the Asian African Legal Consultative Organization concluded a memorandum of understanding to serve as a guiding tool in identifying and carrying out specific collaborative activities in the field of environmental law. Our gathering today provides us with an opportunity to identify the development and strengthening of mechanisms for peaceful settlement of environmental disputes as one of the collaborative activities going forward. Mr. President, in addition, UNEP has played a significant role in facilitating and assisting in the avoidance and settlement of international environmental disputes by providing scientific and technical expertise as well as fact-finding services. For instance, in 2006, Mr. President, UNEP, following a request from the government of Cote d'Ivoire, undertook an independent environmental assessment of sites affected by the dumping of toxic waste from a ship known as Probo Koala. The objective was to determine if these sites continued to pose risks to the environment or to public health, and to make recommendations about additional or corrective cleanup measures required in case contamination was detected. The assessment eventually revealed that none of these sites where waste from Probo Koala were dumped showed contamination exceeding the limits set by the government of Cote d'Ivoire. The Probo Koala case is a classical example of the international community increasingly paying attention to the need to develop and use means of dispute avoidance, and to the closely related question of improving implementation of and compliance with international obligations. It further augments the case for effective dispute resolution mechanisms, which are incorporated in the most multilateral environmental agreements. Permit me to discuss some of these mechanisms, Mr. President. Several multilateral environmental agreements contain provisions for the submission of disputes arising from their interpretation or application to the International Court of Justice. Article 20 of the Basel Convention and Article 27 of the Convention of Biological Diversity are examples in this regard. Other treaties, such as Convention on International Trade in the Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, provide for referral disputes to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Yet other treaties have disputes resolution tribunals built within this framework. For instance, Article 288 of UNCLOS allows parties to refer disputes concerning interpretation or application of the convention to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Court of Justice, or an arbitral tribunal. The protocol to the Antarctic Treaty on Environmental Protection also provides a comprehensive scheme for the settlement of the environmental disputes. Though the protocol does not create any new court, but disputes concerning interpretation or application of certain articles of the protocol are subject to compulsory arbitration once attempts at negotiation and conciliation have been exhausted. Mr. President, the settlement of environmental disputes may also fall within the competence of treaty bodies. For example, US-Canadian International Joint Commission has the mandate to act as an arbitrator with consent of both parties. The Commission for the Environmental Cooperation, established under the 1993 North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, also has dispute settlement powers to ensure that each party effectively enforces its own environmental laws through appropriate government actions. A trend has also emerged, Mr. President, where international and regional financial institutions and civil society are playing important roles in environmental dispute avoidance and dispute settlement. International and regional financial institutions are doing this by, inter alia, providing incentives to countries to resolve environmental problems, such as giving, in appropriate cases, financial or technical assistance, approving only projects that are environmentally sound and that, at the very least, do not create international tensions, but help relieve already existing tensions or serve to prevent the creation of new ones, and taking into account compliance by countries with the environmental obligations in approving projects. Civil society, on the other hand, has, for instance, been alerting governments and intergovernmental organizations to environmental problems. Mr. President, in practice, however, environmental disputes rarely reach the point of binding settlement. This is largely attributable to the fact that parties to international environmental agreements are ordinarily required to cooperate and exchange information in circumstances that are likely to give rise to dispute over compliance with obligation under the agreement. This is in line with Principle 19 of the Rio Declaration, which provides that states shall provide prior and timely notification and relevant information to potentially affected states on activities that may have a significant adverse transboundary environmental effect, and shall consult with those states at an early stage and in a good faith. A special dispute resolution mechanism that goes beyond the classical settlement of disputes, as envisaged under Article 33 of the UN Charter, is the non-compliance procedures. Mr. President, non-compliance procedures are designed to be forward-looking, facilitative, non-confrontational, and emphasize cooperation, and therefore well-suited to address non-compliance within a multilateral context. The non-compliance approach, which favors prevention, follows the general trend in international environmental law, which relies to a greater degree on such means as reporting or verification processes rather than having recourse to settlement of dispute procedure. Mr. President, several multilateral environmental agreements, including the 1985 Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone the 1987 Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Basel Convention have set up non-compliance procedures. The non-compliance procedures are regarded as those most effective mechanisms in assuring compliance with multilateral environmental agreements, especially because they are aimed mainly at helping a state in a non-compliance rather than the imposition of sanctions. They are thus more effective for bringing about environmental improvement. However, Mr. President, in cases where states continue in non-compliance despite provision of assistance, and in cases of blatant disregard to implement international rules, the use of sanctions, such as is the case under the CITES Convention and the Climate Change Convention, provides a useful tool for dispute avoidance and settlement. Another recent and innovative dispute avoidance and resolution mechanism, Mr. President, is the Environmental Rights Initiative. The initiative works with the governments to strengthen institutional capacities to develop and implement policy and legal frameworks that protect environmental rights effectively and inclusively. It supports civil society organizations and vulnerable populations in their efforts to access information on their rights and raises awareness of environmental rights violation. Mr. President, the initiative also collaborates with media on the training of journalists on issues related to environmental rights and environmental defenders with a view to improve coverage of rights issues. And more recently, the initiative has begun engaging with businesses, including through the UN Global Compact, to help them to better understand the environmental rights responsibility and to provide guidance on how to move from a compliance culture to championing environmental rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, dispute settlements remains an important tool for dealing with international environmental problems. UNEP and Aalco should explore modalities for promoting non-compliance procedures as suitable mechanisms for environmental dispute settlement and avoidance. The fifth Montevideo Program for the Development and Periodic Review of Environmental Law for the decade beginning in 2020, Montevideo Program 5, which has among its objectives strengthening the effective implementation of environmental law, provides a key avenue to enhance capacity to ensure effective development and implementation of environmental dispute settlement mechanisms. Mr. President, international and regional financial institutions can and should play an important role in environmental dispute avoidance and dispute settlement. UNEP and Aalco should reach out to these institutions to advance the idea. Governments, civil society, environmental NGOs, the business community, the media, and other relevant stakeholders have a key role in promoting environmental avoidance and settlement of disputes. Mr. President, the Environmental Rights Initiative provides a common platform for all these stakeholders to work collaboratively towards this goal. Finally, Mr. President, UNEP and Aalco need to reinvigorate the Memorandum of Understanding as an avenue for promoting the establishment and strengthening of mechanisms for environmental dispute avoidance and settlement. I thank you very much, Mr. President, and wish you fruitful deliberations as we look forward to continuing our collaborations on environmental protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a new frontier, but very relevant and very important. The partnership which you have called for between UNEP and Aalco should expand and be enriched. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of the intervention from general statements. I think we deserve to have a break for lunch. Let's do as we did yesterday, take 1 hour to save time for lunch, then come back. We continue at now, we come back at 2:45.